Hi, I'm Chris from Airwindows, and hey, you can do this. But a fair question is, why would you want to do that? And I'm going to see whether I can't answer that for you today, because this is Kalman. This is the Airwindows Kelman filter, and it's something I'm trying to build into an upcoming version of console that I'm working on real busily. I hope it's going to work. However, the way this thing functions, this is the same basic technology that I'm using on Air 3, and you've already got Air 3, so it works there. The interesting thing about that was that people were trying it out and saying, oh, this sounds extra good subtracting brightness, not just for adding brightness. It's not just an air boost, but it works in both directions equally well. And that's very interesting and very promising, certainly promising with regard to putting out a new console version based on that. But I wanted to also build in another band, as in a mid-range to bass crossover that used this technology. And what I found was it didn't do what I expected. Let's hear that again. We don't hear anything until we start turning up the cutoff, which I have labeled Kalman. And we're starting to see an effect that I talked about when mentioning the Air 3 plugin. Used as a subsonic cutoff, it does a sort of kick drum spotlighting effect. It does a weird thing. But you'll notice as I keep moving it around, it's interacting in an unusual way. With this, I've got it cranked up as far as I can. The inverse wet control is cranked up as far as it'll go. And that's also how I'm producing a high pass-like effect. Used in an actual mix, and I should pause this to mention that I'm looking to set up Console X with a version of this at every stage, including Air 3. It's going to have Air 3 and this, determining what you might consider to be bands, but they won't work like frequency bands, not even slightly, on individual channels, and on the submixes, and on the master bus. So you're going to have like Air 3 on the master bus as well as in every other place. So what we're doing here is investigating the way it sounds. And it's not working like a normal crossover, because it's not. It's not a normal crossover, it's a Kalman filter. And what a Kalman filter does is it tries to get the underlying waveform, the underlying data, as accurately represented as possible. When you start using that in the mid-range, where we can hear details most clearly, the artifacts also become mid-range artifacts. And they sound a little bit like a sort of grind and crackle. It's pulling out things like dynamics and percussion. Move it a little higher, and we're still hearing artifacts. We're still hearing a behavior. It's somewhat dynamic related, but it's not acting like a clean crossover, because it's going to let sort of the muscle through in higher frequencies than you'd otherwise have. If the waveform is producing an effect that is a accurate sounding physicality of an instrument, it will put that through whether or not it's honoring the specific frequency that it's told to honor. And we also can do that oppositely by subtracting it using the inverse control. What this would be in the final result would be having it split into multiple bands and then cutting the bottom band and leaving only the mid-range. As you can see, we can get highs this way, much like with Air 3, but then we're starting to hear some of those artifacts. And we can keep going and going and going. To where we're even hearing bass, but it's not simply a crossover, it's changing the texture of this whole mix. We can sit it in the middle there where the mid-range is going. And we hear the same kind of gnarling artifact going on, but with a different character. And I've been showing this entirely with the most extreme settings, so you can hear the artifacts. Because what this is going to become in Console X, and I'm working on a lot of things, I'll tell you in a minute some more of the things I'm working on, but in Console X, this is going to go into 3 different bands that are not really oriented around being called frequency things. I don't really want to call it mid-range, I don't really want to call it bass. It doesn't really describe what's happening. This that is called Kalman here, which is like a frequency cutoff control, I'm going to be calling range. And the bands that we are going to arrive at will be air, fire, and stone. So let's hear what that might mean in the context of allowing the other bands to show up. Listen to what happens here. We've got all this going on with the same chorus that I've been using for this whole example. And we've got it set to full inverse in a place where the artifacts are most obvious. You can kind of hear them crackling away. But as I include a little bit more of the dry signal, that's going to have the same effect as if you had the 2 controls, a fire and a stone control. And if they matched, it would be the original signal coming through, because it's being done subtractively. So what's going to happen is I'll bring some of the dry signal back, and the artifacts will kind of magically change to not be obnoxious sounding anymore. And the end result will be is if you had this as separate controls and then decided this feels more solid and it doesn't exciting enough for me, I'm going to find a suitable range to do this in, and then I'm going to pull the stone slider back a little bit, but leave fire where it is, or push the fire slider up in hopes of making more excitement happen, because it sounds a little bit too solid. It sounds a little bit not enough interest and mojo going on. And you'll hear this now. Here is first just fire only, which is Kalman and subtracting everything that it generates. Isn't the sight I wanted to see? My baby, you got your eyes for me. This isn't the sight I wanted to see. My baby, you got your. So we can kind of hear that. This isn't the sight I wanted to see. And that's dry. Baby, you got your eyes for me. There's our full weight, close to dry. And as we pull that back, we're seeing a little bit more of that mid-ranginess jumping out. And it's jumping out in a particularly useful way. Or, supposing we want to do the opposite. Let's find a setting where we're using the Kalman filter to roll off. let's suppose that we're using that. We'll even go back to the beginning again for vocals, wanting to make it duller and a little less aggressive, a little less abrasive, but then we're going to pull it back so that the wet control is allowing a little bit of the dry in there. The middle is going to be dry only, and that'll give us back some of our mid-range. Give us back some of our highs, and it'll be a little bit like this. And doing that, I can mellow out the tone by taking what I'm going to call fire band out and leaving it mostly the stone band, which is just all about the solidity at whatever frequency, no matter what frequency we choose, whether it's the lowest lows, for instance. And then we can allow the highs to peak in. This is going to be interesting to hear. An amazingly small amount of highs will make this sound normal again. That's just 0.882 on the control. And yet this could almost sound like normal. Almost sounds like something that is not wildly EQ'd. We're using what's going to be called stone control, which is Kalman filter cranked up all the way. To add deep lows to this overall mix. And when you're combining the parts of it, this is the lows and then the highs. And you mix them together and you wind up with the original sound again. And the interesting thing about it is the subtleties that you can achieve through mixing these very striking things, and they do not separate from each other cleanly along any particular frequency boundary. So it makes me not even want to call the result mid and bass or anything like that, although it does act kind of like that. You produce the extreme effect and then you use it in small amounts to get useful results. This will probably be just as useful of a high frequency cutter. Here, I'll lose the headphones for the moment. This should be just as useful as a high frequency cutter as Air 3, but with this one you can dial it in. And it depends completely upon your willingness to just use it more subtly, to have the full amount produce that extreme effect, and then dial it right back. So you're doing more of a tilt kind of effect, but knowing that if you used it at full crank, it wouldn't be like a tilt effect at all. It would act very extreme, but there would be these powerful artifacts. Turns out you can use that in both directions, and it proves just as useful at low frequencies or middle frequencies or high frequencies, but everywhere along the line, it's not going to give you a clean dividing line among the frequencies because it is doing a dividing line among textures. And that's what's going to be really interesting about Console X when I put it out. This is such a big experiment that I kind of need to build it and fool with it myself, try doing some mixes that way. If it works, I'll actually have another album coming out with the stuff that I did over the last couple of years. But it should be interesting. I am looking to stage the topology of Console X using something that is a little bit similar to some of the stuff Chris Lord-Alge does. I was recently watching a video with him in it. Similar also to Browerization, where it's designed to run submixes for absolutely everything. But the submixes will all be designed to work at different depths. For instance, you'll have a submix which, rather than it being your reverb return, you'd send certain things to the deep field submix. For instance, if you want guitars or whatever to be huge and not in your face and poking the eardrums of your ears. That would go to its own submix. And then you'd have, say, another thing that I'm working on, which is a great guitar hall sound. And you wouldn't have it be cranked up all the way. You'd use only as much of that reverb as you needed to, and then you would be using discontinuity, which is another plugin that's coming out pretty soon, to set up the tone of air being driven very loud at whatever dynamics you consider that section of the mix to be. And then you'd have other things, like if you had a quiet vocal coming in just like this, and you needed to mix that with loud guitars, that would be coming in along a different submix. And that submix would probably not have a lot of reverb on it, or maybe it would have a really close, platey room kind of thing. And you'd be using the instance of Air 3 inside that submix to push the highs there, as well as in whatever channel you were using. And then the main mix bus would also have the ability to push the highs or balance between what I'm calling fire and stone texture. And it's going to be real interesting and maybe very difficult. I don't know. We'll find out. But it will mean that every stage, layer, and depth level of the mix will get its own custom framing with these controls that are all based on the Kalman filtering and don't work like normal controls. And I just wonder what's going to be produced there. It seems like this is an interesting thing to be working on. I'm putting a lot of time and effort into it. And I do have some other stuff coming along, like revisions on a slightly more, you know how I have capacitor 2, and you can put this nonlinearity into it, which is like what certain ceramic capacitors did in real life. I've got that working on biquad filters, and I've got it working on the pair filters I came up with, which is in some ways even more exciting. So next time I do produce a console version with letters at the end of it that's designed to sound like a real-life analog console, I will be able to do stuff that's not based on Kalman filters. I don't know whether the air filter is always going to be desirable, but I feel kind of like, at least for certain things, like if I was to do an SSL old school, I'd want to be using stuff that behaved like it had tight little crossovers in order for people to be able to get the sounds that you're supposed to be able to get using that stuff. And now I have a new sort of analogification technique for using with that. That's pretty exciting. But yeah. Oh, also, one final thing. The work that I've been doing with Juce, which is the GUI framework that is set up so that it will give me the ability to put out VST3s, GPL3 open source VST3, so I shouldn't have to sign off on anything and it won't take anything away from my project. I have not only got resizable meters and things up and working, but I've also got it setting up controls, making the controls be resizable, completely and totally resizable, and talking to the audio thread. So that was pretty much the last week that I spent working on those things. And it was a couple of brutal 8-hour days figuring out that stuff, because I remind you, I don't know how to program in C++, and I don't know anything about Juice. So the idea of attempting something like that is, shall we say, very foolish. I have no business trying to do this. There's no reason that I should succeed. But I'm starting to get it working. And if I can get it working, I can put stuff out that people can have. And that's going to be very exciting. So with that, I'm going to get back to work, and I'll talk to you folks later. Bye-bye.